here today to talk about the very real threat that climate change poses to food security. And my central message is one of real concern, but also one of optimism, because I believe that we have the necessary tools to design crops and cropping systems that can be both resilient and sustainable. But I'm going to start with a short story about a very important moment in Earth's history. Once upon a time, some enterprising species developed a new way to exploit a very abundant resource in the environment. This new way allowed the species to store and release energy with greater convenience and much more efficiency than previous ways of living. Unfortunately, this new approach to drive the economy of life came with a side effect. It produced huge amounts of poisonous gas that threatened nearly every living thing on Earth. Now, if this moment sounds familiar to you, it shouldn't, because the energy economy that I'm talking about is the evolution of a new kind of photosynthesis, some 2.5 billion years ago. And the poisonous waste was oxygen. Today, the species exploiting a seemingly infinite source of energy is, of course, us. And the poisonous waste is really a cocktail of chemicals, most notably carbon dioxide. Once again, this gaseous waste has radically changed Earth's atmosphere and threatens the living world as we know it. Then as now, the organisms that generated that waste and the organisms who most benefited from it, its presence, came to dominate the biosphere. What can this ancient evolutionary innovation teach us about today's major challenge in energy, life, and the atmosphere, the human dependence on fossil fuel? The first and saddest truth is that many of those organisms who dominated Earth before oxygen became abundant went extinct or were relegated to the odd little corners of the Earth where free oxygen was rare. But many new opportunities were created for organisms that could use oxygen in their own energetic economies, not least of whom were the plants and animals that today dominate the biosphere. In other words, this new atmosphere changed the ecological conditions for life. And then evolution shaped the metabolic strategies over the survivors over many millions of years. What can we do to make sure that we are in that second group of organisms, again this time, the ones that made the best of this new world? The second sad reality about our current predicament is that the rate at which we're adding this poison to the atmosphere is much faster. And we've continued this hazardous lifestyle long after we've understood the consequences. I want to say right now that we desperately need to reduce anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases. We've passed the point of no return when it comes to changing Earth's atmosphere and biosphere in very serious ways. So, just like organisms did 2.5 billion years ago, when they were faced with toxic levels of oxygen, we're going to need to figure out how to exploit this extra CO2 that the previous generations of humans have left us with. And I think we can do that while we're making our crops more sustainable at the same time, which is really what I'm here to talk about. Now, plants, as you're likely aware, do some pretty amazing chemical reactions. They take energy from the sun, they break apart a water molecule, they shuttle around some protons and electrons, and they turn atmospheric carbon dioxide into carbohydrates. These carbohydrates, in turn, are the backbone of all terrestrial life. Plants use them to build their bodies, to fuel their cells, to make their seeds. And we get our nutrition by eating those plant tissues and seeds, or by eating the animals that eat them. Now, when we talk about plants and the resources they need to grow, plant biologists like me like to distinguish between two things. First are the tissues that supply the resource for the plant. In the case of carbon, those tissues are the leaves where photosynthesis happens, converting atmospheric CO2 into sugars. The second are the tissues where that carbon ends up. Make more leaves, you can do more photosynthesis. Make more roots, you can capture more water and more nutrients. You can grow a longer stem to outcompete your neighbors. You can store for a bad day. Or you can make seeds to continue your genetic line and feed us. And it's the balance between these two things, the source and what we call the sink for fixed carbon, that offers us an opportunity to improve crop resilience. Now, many of my colleagues are focused on making the source more efficient or more resilient to the upcoming changes in temperature and precipitation. They're interested in making photosynthesis work better. And this is excellent work that is making tremendous progress. My central interest and concern is what's happening on the carbon sink side. More efficient photosynthesis or elevated atmospheric CO2 should provide more carbon to the plant. This is the so-called CO2 fertilization effect. Now, what a plant does with its carbon can tell you a lot about that plant's strategy for survival. A plant that lives someplace with big hungry herbivores maybe has invested lots of carbon into chemical or structural defense. A plant that lives someplace with unpredictable resource availability might invest in storage to make sure it has some energy to power its cells when photosynthesis is not as reliable. Or a plant that's been bred by humans to feed us might invest basically everything it can in reproduction. I like to make the analogy that a lot of our modern crops, like corn, wheat, and rice, are kind of like Ferraris. They do one thing really, really well. But very few of us own Ferraris because aside from being extraordinarily expensive, they're really impractical. They're hard to drive, they're liable to get stolen, they get miserable fuel economy, and they pretty much do only one thing really well. They go fast. And along these same lines, the corn that we grow in Iowa is really fine-tuned. It takes a lot of fertilizer, but it grows quickly and reliably and does one thing really, really well. It makes lots of seed. But these plants are also susceptible to the very kinds of unpredictable climate variation that we now expect to see as a result of anthropogenic climate change. Because they invest so much into that one nice tall stalk and in filling as many sugar-rich kernels as they can, they don't leave much of a buffer against environmental adversity. In a sense, corn and crops like it have been bred to have one very, very strong carbon sink. It's their grain. So let's get back to all that poison that we put into the atmosphere. Biologists like me are really interested in how plants react to all this extra CO2 in the atmosphere. And the short answer is that many of them, under certain conditions, for now, fix more carbon and use less water. And that's great news. The bad news is that the story is, of course, much more complicated. We have evidence that some of our elite crop varieties of corn, rice, and wheat, the ones that feed us, don't actually increase their seed yield very much when they're grown at high CO2. And more alarmingly, they often put less protein and less iron into the seeds that they do grow. Our food could become less nutritious in the future as a result of elevated CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, I want to make the case for a novel approach to ensure that we have access to nutritious, high-yielding crops in this new high CO2 world. We need to identify those crop varieties that can actually use all this extra CO2 to increase their yield. Some of these might be the so-called orphan crops, like the grains and pulses that never made it into modern cropping systems. We also need to better understand the mechanisms that these plants use, which makes them so much better at taking all that extra carbon and making something useful. Now, I'm confident that this approach will work because scientists have studied the yield responses of CO2 to crop varieties that are commonly grown today and compared that with the crop varieties that were grown in the early 1900s. Now, although these modern crop varieties produce copious seed when grown under modern cropping technologies, it's actually the older crop varieties that show an increase in biomass and yield under higher atmospheric CO2. In the parlance of plant biologists, we bred for a small number of very strong carbon sinks. But with extra carbon, either from rising atmospheric CO2 or from food photosynthesis, it's really unclear to me whether these modern plants have a strong enough sink to accommodate all the new sugar. And I think one reason that these new varieties don't increase the yield is actually an unfortunate byproduct of the Green Revolution and those Ferrari corn plants that we now have. You see, wild grasses often make extra stems, just in case that life is better than they expect later in the season, and they can exploit these newly abundant resources to make more seed. But during the Green Revolution, plant breeders deliberately selected for varieties that only made a few short, very sturdy stems, each with a productive seed head at the top. Now, in my lab at MIT, we've identified species of grasses that increase their growth significantly as we add CO2. And we're using genomic approaches to understand why some of their close relatives don't have the same positive responses to CO2. The genetic differences that we identify, we hope, could become targets for breeding or for biotechnology in our crops. The approach we're using is also helping to understand why different grass species store more or less extra carbon for a rainy day. And putting some of this excess carbon aside might slightly reduce yields when the environment is favorable, but it will buffer plants against those inevitable periods of drought, which we think will become more common in the decades ahead. Now, I'm proposing a fairly old school approach to address our looming food crisis. Conventional breeding informed by ecology and genetics, with an appreciation for the evolutionary trade-offs inherent in plant-environment interaction. And this may come as a bit of a surprise coming from an engineer teaches at a university that's well known for its technological hacks to the world's problems. But the simple answer is this: we need a better basic understanding of plant science before we can begin to tackle these broader questions and these broader challenges using modern technology. What can we do as citizens to help prevent a shortage of food in the coming decades? The first is we need to support basic science. CRISPR and modern technology can do some amazing things with plant genomes, but I'd argue that we're a ways off from understanding the most effective changes to actually make our crops more resilient. Our policymakers and our philanthropists should continue to support independent creative science. The second thing we can do on a more practical basis is to identify more sustainable food sources that are already in the marketplace. Heritage grains and legumes are often grown under conditions in fields that sequester more carbon in their roots in their soils as compared to industrial corn production that dominates global calories. Choosing these products increases demand and also encourages farmers to plant more diverse crops. And really, in truth, it's going to be traditional breeding, consumer choice, biotechnology, farm management, all working hand in hand if we're going to achieve our aims of maintaining food production in the coming decades. And this is a tall order, but I think it's not one that's any more technologically challenging than what we successfully accomplished during the Green Revolution. And it's certainly no more of a challenge than our ancestors experienced as single cells 2.5 billion years ago. Thanks.